Today we are going to talk a bit about TV, and then we'll review for the quiz that is coming up next class. We're going to end up a little bit early today, hopefully. Maybe not, I don't know. Before we begin, just an announcement that I'll also make online. But at the broadcasting department, of which I am a part, we also cover the Board of Trustees meetings here at City College. And if you're ever interested in volunteering to get some hands-on video television making experience with professional equipment and help from our awesome video staff here, you could contact Susan Bachman. So that's her email address, that's her telephone number. So what it involves is there are 5 more events, and you wouldn't have to be at every single one. But what it is they're meetings of the Board of Trustees of City College. And so as a service, our department videotapes and live streams those. So it's like a mobile video shoot. So you would learn about how to set up and break down cameras, audio, switcher, how to run those things, at least enough in order to get a decent quality recording. And they supply a little bit of food, I think, and it's usually a good thing. So setup begins around 1, the meeting starts at 4, and in the little notice that I'll send out, it has the actual dates. But it's a good way to get a little bit of experience and see if you enjoy, professional video field production, which is a little more demanding than taking your phone and shooting something for YouTube, So I'll send out but you could always just shoot her an email and she'd send it to you, but I'll put it up on our course website as well, okay? Now, regarding the quiz that's coming up, I sent out another announcement, so everyone should probably receive that in their City College email. But also, I'm telling it to you now in person and streaming. So we have a quiz coming up on Wednesday. You can either take it...
Thursday.
Pardon me? Thursday, sorry, yeah. Oh, did I say Wednesday? Okay, that's not bad. That's terrible, so that will confuse everybody. So, thanks, Sarah.
Sure.
So, Thursday, that's better. I'm all confused on my days. Did I say that anywhere else? No. All right, on the fly, we correct it. So I don't know if that gets pushed to you again. Did that happen? We'll see. People will know Thursday, but that's better. So reviewing today in class, you can either write the quiz in class on paper on Thursday, or you can write it online during class time through Canvas if you want to stay home and do it that way, okay? There's 25 questions. You get 30 minutes to do the quiz. They're multiple choice. We're going to be reviewing now for that. And there's also here a little video that you can watch, which contains all of the PowerPoints with all of the answers on that might be the questions on the quiz. So check out the stuff that's in red, okay? And so, for instance, books and newspapers were a great example of the one-to-many model. Shannon and Weaver made the mathematical model of communication, so on and so forth. Okay, so check out on that video what is red. Understand what's a cognitive effect, what's an emotional effect, what's a behavioral effect of media. And as I said, once we do a quick kind of run through the history of television, which we will circle back next class after the quiz, and we'll fill in some more. So we're just going to capture some key dates in the development of television today, and then we'll go through the review materials. But they are up here on Canvas, and they should have all been pushed to you through the announcement. The announcement automatically sends to your email address. So, questions about that? If you come to class, you write it in class. If you stay home, it's open during class time at home. Okay, and you get to choose. Righto. Glad there's no questions. That sounds far too clear to be to be good, but we'll see. All right. So moving on to TV, a number of things we'll note. You guys okay? So first off, we'll look at a little video in a sec about the experimental years of television. But you know, as we said there was a mechanical type of TV which came out, you know, well before we had electronic television. So that's an interesting shot from the mechanical version of TV, which was developed in England, and you can still see kind of working systems of it in museums and stuff. Wasn't very good. And then the race to develop electronic TV, which looked better, and that was pitted two competing inventors, one against the other. So we'll get on to who they were when we look at that little video. But you know, as we said, FM radio was delayed by Sarnoff, especially from NBC, because RCA and NBC were bankrolling the development of electronic television at the time. And they didn't want people to go out and spend their money on an FM radio receiver when they had already just bought an AM radio receiver maybe 10 years earlier. And they could see where television was coming. It was going to be considerably more expensive as well, because you had to buy a picture tube and everything else along with your TV. So FM was delayed. But in 1939, TV was rolled out at the New York World's Fair. That was that fancy, futuristic World's Fair just outside of New York City. You can still go by and see some of the pavilions there. And so they had a functional television system in '39. There were just very, very few people who could receive it, because they hadn't started to mass produce the receivers and stuff like that. All of the development is caught up in the Second World War, which, you remember, you know, in terms of electronics manufacturing, the country turned its attention to radar systems and stuff that was useful in the war effort. So that delayed television as well until the end of the war, when in the mid to late 40s, the initial, you know, the big television stations, the early originators jumped in. So if you look in San Francisco, we had KGO, KCBS, which is now KPIX, and also KRON. They all jumped in, and they were early television licensees in the late 40s. So a big city like San Francisco would have each of those television stations taking off. Now, they were already networked because they were building on the existing broadcasting industry as they found it, which meant that, you know, there was a CBS affiliate, there was an ABC affiliate, and there was an NBC affiliate here in the Bay Area, and those were the originating television stations that took off. At the end of the 40s, everything came to a screeching halt as, once again, the FCC realized that it would be necessary to set some standards in order for the business to work rationally. So they had to do things like develop consistent channel designations that would work all over the United States. So they suspended licensing for a couple of years while they got that together, which was, again, a great boon to those original stations that came in the early and late 40s before the freeze went in. So they were able to get a couple of years to really establish themselves before any competition came along when the FCC began to license new stations. As the business developed, there were not enough VHF channels to accommodate all the demand in the big urban centers like San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York City. So if you had been alive when I was first born, and I do remember this, like we had a TV with like a rotary dial, you go click, 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 and that was channel 2 to 13, which had all the good stuff on it because those were all the network, they call them network affiliates. So affiliates, you've probably heard of this And you may even know what it means, but just to clarify, so those 3 stations that I mentioned, for instance, KGO, the ABC affiliate, so would be one of those 3 stations. So KGO was a privately owned station, but it signed a contract with the ABC network so that it would, they say, clear. So they would clear all of ABC's programming, which means that KGO would sign with ABC and they would promise to show everything that ABC gave them. So they became an affiliate station by signing that contract. That means they would show only ABC content and they would show all of that ABC content. So that was called clearance, when you signed a contract that promised to show all of the network content. Why do you think that would be important from a business standpoint? If you became an affiliate station, why would the network really want you to promise to show everything? Think about the business way, selling advertising and such. What would happen if you didn't show those ABC shows? If you decided, I don't like that one, I won't put it on. What would happen?
It's against the contract.
It would break the contract, true. Well, and the reason why the contract is in place, the network is busy in New York selling advertising across the country on those network stations, right? What they cannot have is, stations here and there that don't show the programs that they're selling advertising on. So the way it works is the local station would get 50% of the commercial time on air, and the network would have 50% of the commercial time on air. And so the network would be busy in New York selling them. KGO would be busy in San Francisco selling locally. But if KGO didn't show everything that they promised to show, then imagine the sales efforts in New York would be totally, messed up, because you'd be selling and then the show wouldn't ever air in San Francisco. So that's why the clearance was very important, that the affiliates, so these are private stations, but they promised to clear all the network stuff. Ron, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I was going to say, so would it have anything to do with competition?
Well, yeah, for sure, because each of these stations is in competition with the other for the advertising dollars, and also for ratings. So when we get into a little bit of how ratings work, the more popular a station and with its programs is, the higher they can sell their advertising for. So it became really important to be an affiliate. In fact, it still is important. We'll talk more about Cron. Anybody watch KRON, Cron? You're aware of it, Ron, a little bit? Yeah. It shows, like hours and hours of news. It was once the NBC affiliate, but it lost that affiliation. It's now an independent station. And in terms of making money, as an affiliate, you make the most amount of money possible if you're a network affiliate, like an ABC affiliate. If you're an independent, like Cron, which means you have no affiliation with a network, you make the least amount of money of all kinds of television stations. It's very hard to be an independent because you don't get that heavily promoted content which network stations get. So it's really important to be a network affiliate. If you're an independent, you don't make very much money at all. So as it says here, before the freeze, back to the history, as we said, in the late 1940s, like 48, 49, they freeze the channel licensing for a couple of years while they work it out. And after the freeze, they have the very high VHF channels 2 through 13, which, it's, if you're on your cable, you can still find channel 2, you can find channel 8 and such. But then on top of that, they added more frequencies because there was more demand. So those were the UHF channels, which weren't as good quality. And when I was like a little kid, underneath the knob that went click, 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 there was another one that just kind of spun. And so it was like tuning your radio. You just spin the dial, spin it until you got to what you thought was channel 83 or something. So it was pretty weird. That was broadcasting way back in those days. So UHF didn't look as good, and it was harder to tune than VHF. So again, those that got in before the freeze, they got in on the VHF band, better quality, and they had a few years of no competition, basically, except between each other. But there were nothing else to watch. They also reserved some channels for educational television, which didn't have a lot of distribution associated with it yet. In other words, there was no public broadcasting service at that point until the 1960s. But there was an acknowledgement from Congress that they should have some educational TV. Now contrast this with a lot of countries in Europe, elsewhere in the world, where it was a public broadcaster with an educational mission that was the start of all of it. But here in the United States, it was private commercial broadcasters generally providing entertainment that led the way. And there was very little educational television, especially in the beginnings, until the 60s, kind of the civil rights movement and all of that social consciousness led to, let's do something and let's get ourselves some educational TV. Right? Then came color TV, early 60s, where there were two systems, so more technical competition. CBS, the network, had a system which was incompatible with the black and white system, which had come in the 40s. The black and white system was called NTSC. They figured out a little bit late how they could add color to the black and white system so that people didn't have to yet again buy a whole new television set. What that meant was that with this new RCA system, still NTSC, they started broadcasting a signal that was everyone with a black and white TV could see it in black and white. But if you bought a color TV, then you could see the same program in color. So you didn't have to tune into two different stations or anything like that. They would just broadcast everything in color, and if you had a black and white TV, you'd see it in black and white. So you could see how that would be advantageous because you didn't have to buy a new TV necessarily. Consequently, you can see if you read the newspapers and stuff, all through the 60s, the broadcasters are going, wow, they're really not color is not being adopted as fast as we had hoped, And they did all kinds of promotional things to get people getting color because, they're always in competition with movies. And of course, having movies were in color and they wanted people to have color TV as well. So this was the norm until 2009 when the FCC required everybody to switch over to high definition TV. So that's already 9 years ago, but I don't know. You guys remember when the little square TV became the widescreen? Yeah, Dylan, you're nodding. It was a big deal?
Yeah, it was a big deal.
It sure looks a lot better.
I mean, I remember we used to have those huge TVs with the big back set, and then they became so small and
right. If you wanted a big screen TV, it took up a huge part of your room.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Dumont network in the 1950s. In the 1950s, there was a fourth network along with ABC, CBS, and NBC. It was called the Dumont network. And they made television cameras, they made receivers, they actually made the programming to go on their network and stuff. It was just too much to sustain, and they went bankrupt pretty quickly. But they also specialized in what for the day were large screen TVs, which would require you to take out the door to move them into the house because they were so huge. But with our flat screen LCDs and OLEDs and all the rest of it, we have it great, And with 4K television now, which is not yet a broadcast standard, but obviously you can stream Netflix and Amazon in 4K, which is a higher definition than high definition. It's ultra high definition. That is the state of the art right now. Not sure if we'll actually broadcast that or if it'll always be through the internet. We'll see about that. So, back then, in the golden age of television, which would have been from the early 50s right through to the mid to late 1970s, the networks controlled their affiliates tightly. So you signed a contract as an affiliate with a network. That meant you promised you would clear all of the programs, you would show everything they gave you. To get the television industry up and running, ABC, CBS, NBC, they took their radio stars, they took the profits from radio, and they poured it into television. CBS, as I mentioned last class, made contracts with all of their stars on radio, got them to perform on television as well, even poached some other stars from other networks by promising them better contracts in television. And they developed this little corporate fiddle where they would, they encouraged big stars to become subcontractors so they would pay less tax. That brought a lot of them over. So they really cannibalized radio. There was all of the variety shows, a lot of, like the Green Hornet, Dragnet, some of these old 1950s big television shows originated in radio. So again, the content of a new medium is often an old medium. So the networks, CBS, NBC, ABC, and Dumont, they all went into recruiting local stations to become their affiliates. You'd have to sign a new contract every year or longer periods, which meant that there was a degree of movement between, a station become one affiliate with one network and maybe change over to another if they if it looked more attractive. Now that kind of settled down, but in the 1970s, in 1980 it launched. But what is the fourth network? That Dumont died. There were three again for a while, but in 1980, what was the fourth broadcast network that came out? Still out there. Think The Simpsons. Fox, that's right, yeah. So Fox was came up in the 1980s as the fourth network, and that was very difficult because at that time, the affiliates were pretty clearly established, ABC, CBS, NBC. So one of the difficulties that Fox had getting going was to get enough affiliate stations throughout the country in those big markets to join them in their network so that they had the kind of size necessary to compete with ABC, CBS, NBC as, big national advertising outlets. That was important. So at the time, if you were an affiliate, the network actually paid you money. So not only did they give you programming and shared with you, they say, okay, you've got, 10 minutes of advertising out of every hour. We can keep 10 minutes of advertising. They also wrote them a check every month to pay them for being the affiliate. Now that has kind of flipped and changed now. In part because sports is so important to broadcast networks, and sports like the NFL is so extremely expensive that the networks that paid billions of dollars to the NFL for these 5-year contracts, they said, look, dear affiliate stations, we're paying billions of dollars up here on the network level to give you these sports shows. You're going to have to help us out. So now instead of Fox writing a check to its affiliate KTVU, they say, no, you got to write us a check to help pay for these sports licenses that are costing us so much money, but are propping up our ratings and stuff. So that's, but back in the day, again, part of how you made so much money as an affiliate was the network would give you money, and people would watch. Oh my God! There was, of course, a moment in the 1950s of paranoia where the government had hearings, both in California here and in Washington, trying to weed out communist sympathizers from amongst many industries, but they focused very heavily on the movie and television industry, in part because movie stars and movie makers were so visible. So it was, in part a kind of a government public relations operation to stir up anti-communist feelings and to, exhibit those both on TV and also attacking people in the entertainment industries and stuff. That peaked with Senator Joseph McCarthy. You've probably all heard the name. McCarthyism was, the kind of peak of this communist blacklisting. But it began before McCarthy actually rose to prominence. But it pretty much ended with him. And one very influential broadcast was on Edward R. Murrow, who, remember, he became famous as a radio broadcaster in the Second World War, broadcasting live from London. In the 50s, he had a show on television called See It Now, which was an early kind of news magazine show. And there's several newspapers, New York Times and the Washington Post, had started to look on McCarthy kind of critically, maybe not the newspapers as a whole, but individual reporters and columnists who started saying, hey, McCarthy's going too far. Murrow bought into that and aired a documentary which actually showed McCarthy in action, bullying the witnesses, like histrionics, sweating, just like kind of over-the-top behavior, quite undignified. So they aired that, pretty critical. And McCarthy was furious, wrote to CBS and said, you're unpatriotic, you're doing terrible things. And so CBS and Murrow's show said, well, why don't you come on and do a rebuttal? And so they sent a crew and he filmed a rebuttal. And he looked so kind of psycho when he was doing his rebuttal that almost sunk him too. He was just like freaking out on camera a little bit, especially in those early days. They didn't know how to be that camera friendly. They didn't realize that, this crazy talking head is coming into your living room and ranting at you. It didn't work that well. Sam?
Although to be fair, the Red Scare was a little bit much, actually a lot of bit much. Communism is responsible for the deaths of 85 million people. The fear was justified, but the actions to take another point out. At least 85 million deaths.
Gotcha. Well, thank you for that. But they were not investigating or prosecuting any of the people who killed anyone. They were largely attacking Jewish writers of the entertainment industry who, another interesting fact was many of them had communist affiliations from the 1930s, when the only people who were against the Nazis in the United States in an organized way were the workers' unions and the communist parties, which had no clue of what was going on in Stalin's Russia. Many of those industry people who were later attacked in the blacklist completely renounced communism and said, Christ, we were wrong. We're so sorry. We didn't realize what we were doing. And what we really wanted to do was we were protesting what we knew was going on in Nazi Germany. And the only way to organize, or as we organized, we also, came in touch with communist sympathizers. But of course, that didn't matter at the time. So agreed, communism was not the greatest social force on a global level, but the people we're talking about here were largely just entertainers, like scriptwriters.
I'm saying the fear of communism was absolutely justified. The actions taken were just extreme, though. I mean, I guess they weren't effective enough because the communists are coming back in America.
I don't know, are you trying to be provocative? Because the point about the blacklist is largely that we're talking about entertainment history. Starting a Cold War and an arms race to deter, the advance of communism in the rest of the globe is not really our subject. But agreed that probably was, effective, and God knows how else they could have dealt with it. But the blacklist, was more of our beat, media history. Yeah. All right, so if we're looking at what happened in the 1980s especially, we had developing from the late 50s on, you know, and a supplement to over-the-air broadcasting. And this was called Community Antenna TV, or CATV. And it lives on as cable TV today. So originally the cable TV business was created in order to give you better reception for the broadcast channels. So if you lived outside of a big city, or if you lived on the wrong side of a mountain or something, you'd buy a TV which looked great when you bought it, and you'd get it home and you had horrible reception. So a small business was created whereby individuals would wire up your television to a big antenna they would stick on top of a mountain or something, where they would get good reception. In fact, it was even some department stores or hardware stores that sold TVs that would arrange this for you. So you'd give them $5 and they would attach you to a wire that went up to this antenna, and you get good reception just like they got in the store. So that was the original kind of selling point for this type of, starting in 1980, what changed there was original programming on cable TV. So from the 50s through to the 80s, cable TV basically just reproduced what was over the air, you know, give you better reception. And in fact, you know, Congress looked very doubtfully on the cable TV business. There were restrictions placed on cable television to make sure that it didn't undermine the carefully constructed business that depended on licensing from the FCC and stuff like that. So for instance, cable TV could bring in signals from distant markets, high quality long distance lines that were created, or through microwave transmission that eventually going across the country. But Congress made sure that there were laws in place so that you couldn't, for instance, have a cable system in San Francisco and cut out the stations that existed in the San Francisco market, because that would have destroyed the relationships that had been built up in broadcasting. You could conceivably have taken an ABC affiliate from New York and put it on your cable system here in San Francisco, but that would have cut out KGO, bad business. So they didn't allow that. And they limited the number of channels that you could put on cable TV, because they figured, we don't want to, you know, dissipate the audience. We don't want to let them get too involved in something, you know, that would take away from broadcasting. So the FCC had what they called the must-carry rule, which was that if you had a cable system, you had to carry the local stations that were wherever your cable system was located. And however, HBO, created in '72, starts showing movies, sports, you know, special programming, premium programming, and that's the beginning of cable providing more programming. And nowadays, you know, they provide among the most sophisticated and interesting programs that are out there. So you had MTV starting up in 1980. You had HBO doing the start of their original programming, and eventually you've just got more and more original cable channels and premium programming. There's that. We can look at more development about that next class. As regards educational and public television, very, very famous quote from this fellow, Newton Minow, who's still alive, and I heard him interviewed on radio a couple of months ago. He referred to what television in the 1960s, we called it a vast wasteland, because it was just commercial entertainment with very little educational content. There was also, you know, things like the Kennedy assassination, the Vietnam War. There were significant news events that were broadcast, but that was buried under a lot of entertainment, and they were also concerned about violence at the time. So this led to the 1960s with the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which is the umbrella group which manages congressional funds that are given to both the Public Broadcasting Service, which is the television arm, and then NPR, which is National Public Radio, which is the radio arm. So these are all created in the 1960s. As we said, in that moment of optimistic, liberal changes in the country. I think a lot of this we can catch up on next class, so that we have a chance to do a little review. But yeah, satellites are important. We'll talk about satellites, both consumer satellites, so as an alternative to cable, but also larger satellite systems that allow, for instance, live broadcasts of bombardment of Baghdad or something like that, which was a big deal in the 1980s when CNN was, a new thing, a global news organization that could, stream you, or not stream, but broadcast you live, from Baghdad as bombs are dropping all around and stuff. So it was a big deal, thanks to satellites, right? Okay, just trying to see, is there other stuff here that we are going to need to know about for this quiz? Okay, I don't think so. There's a lot more we can talk about next class. Okay, we'll pick a lot of that up next class. So it's just a brief little doc about the origins of TV. How much time have I got? If I take 11 minutes, that's all right. So this is just about the controversy over who invented television, which, as we know, TV could very well be the result of many people's interventions. So this will cover John Logie Baird, the Scot who created a mechanical TV, and then the duo Vladimir Zworykin, who was working for RCA, and Philo T. Farnsworth, who was trying to invent television on his own. Pretty cool, this history. Is it loud enough? Is it playing? Here we go.
Wait, did you ever wonder how all this happened? How you can turn that knob and enjoy a dramatic show, laugh at a comedian, watch the ball game, or hear and see news from anywhere in the world? Well, it's quite a story, the story of television.
At the beginning, there were all kinds of different names for what we now call television. Some people called it radio vision, or the telephonoscope, or audio vision, or hear listening. The name that finally stuck, of course, was television, although not everyone liked that. The editor of the Manchester Guardian in England said, television, the word is half Greek and half Latin. No good will come of it.
What is the origin of that no-good technology that sits in our living rooms? The smooth electronic picture you're watching right now. Was it invented by an Idaho farm boy, a Russian immigrant, or a Scottish inventor named John Logie Baird?
This is a 1930 Baird televisor. This was the first mass-produced television for the British television market, essentially the first commercially available television for the average person to afford. You could buy this unit with a cabinet on it with a nice bronze plaque on the front for about 25 pounds.
Baird's televisor, invented in 1929, looked radically different from the electronic tubes of modern television. Instead, his was a mechanical system made up of rapidly spinning, rotating parts. In Baird's mechanical television, light from a subject hit a spinning disc, breaking it into pieces. Each piece of light hit a photoelectric cell, which converted the light into electricity. A bright piece generated a lot of electricity. A dark piece, a little. The changing electricity was sent to a receiver, causing a neon bulb to rapidly flicker bright or dark for each bit of the picture. A receiving disc, spinning at the same speed as the first, put the light and dark pieces back together, like a jigsaw puzzle. Early television was a hit in 1925, when John Logie Baird displayed primitive images at a London department store. But when he applied for the first broadcast license ever, the BBC was nervous.
Well, there were two grounds to be afraid of television. One of them was the fear that it would damage the morals of the populace. The other fear of television was much more irrational, and that was the thought that if you had a television set in your house, the BBC could see what you were doing.
You can now.
And there was one woman who was afraid that the television set would be able to see through the bathroom wall. And she wrote a letter to the paper to this effect. These fears have proved groundless.
For a while.
Mechanical TV did have real pitfalls. To show up on the screen, the actors had to wear bright blue paint to accentuate the eyebrows and lips. And the discs could never spin fast enough to create fluid motion. The images would always remain flickery and smudged. This Felix the Cat, the first ever cartoon character broadcast, was as good as it got. Baird's system never did catch on. Though a remarkable achievement, mechanical TV is now just a footnote in history. But even as Baird's idea failed, a new electronic vision was being born.
The summer of 1921 found Philo T. Farnsworth in a sugar beet field in Rigby, Idaho, dreaming of trapping light in an empty jar and sending it one line at a time with a beam of electrons. So we'll pretend that we've got an illustration here of Farnsworth's beet field from the summer of 1921. And we find him tracing the rows across the beet field on his disc harrow, one row after another, monotonously into the afternoon. And then he reaches a point, he looks back behind him, and he sees these rows in the dirt. And at that moment, he realizes how he can use electrons to trace a TV image. And this is exactly how TV is rendered on your screen today, one line at a time, 525 lines per frame, 30 frames per second, just the way Philo Farnsworth envisioned it on the back of a disc harrow in the summer of 1921.
What 14-year-old Farnsworth realized with his tractor was that a beam of electrons could paint a picture finer and faster than a spinning disc. And it could be done with a cathode ray tube.
A cathode ray tube is a glass tube with all the air pumped out of it. It was discovered that if you ran electricity through one end, through a filament at one end of this vacuum tube, that electrons would flow from one end to the other. And that's when you have a cathode ray tube. That's called the cathode ray, that ray of electrons.
Farnsworth's electronic television worked on the same principle as mechanical television, but instead of spinning discs, it used cathode ray tubes. The cathode ray tube fired electricity 1 pixel at a time, causing a special coating on the tube to glow. A lot of electricity created a bright spot. A little electricity, a dark spot. The cathode ray tube could paint a picture in 1/30th of a second, fast enough to create fluid motion. In 1926, with $25,000 in private funding, Farnsworth set up a lab in San Francisco to try to turn his beet field vision into reality.
In this age, when they were beginning to develop electronic television, it's sort of analogous to wanting to is present that could give somebody a tremendous shock. And there's some stories about people in the lab gang getting potassium in their eyes and having their eyesight threatened.
Farnsworth was nearing success, but he had a rival, the brilliant Russian engineer Vladimir Zworykin. As early as 1923, Zworykin had submitted a patent for his own television system, but it was denied because it didn't quite work. He was now trying to perfect his system for the radio giant RCA and their visionary president, David Sarnoff, who saw television's future.
Well, I think one of the great marriages in 20th century science, if you will, was the relationship between Dr. Zworykin and David Sarnoff.
Sarnoff was like this great monopoly master buying up all the hotels on the boardwalk, and he didn't want to pay anyone. He wanted to have total patent control over television. And he was hoping Zworykin would do that for him. But Farnsworth was ahead of them and had some patents from 1927, 1928.
Zworykin is given instructions to visit Farnsworth's lab in 1930. And Farnsworth does not know that Zworykin is actually working for RCA because he comes from the Westinghouse labs. So Farnsworth is very forthcoming, believing that he has met a fellow traveler on this new frontier. He is entirely forthcoming and shows him virtually everything that he has developed in the last 3 or 4 years in San Francisco. And he shows Zworykin the finished image dissector tube, and Zworykin holds it in his hand, and there are many eyewitnesses that heard him say, "This is a beautiful instrument. I wish that I had invented it."
Whether Zworykin actually stole Farnsworth's design is unclear, but shortly after his visit, he finally had an electronic camera tube that worked. It even made a brighter picture than Farnsworth's. Under a quirk of patent law, he was able to submit his new system under the original 1923 patent. Meanwhile, Farnsworth had also been successful with his camera and receiver. The key to both men's success? The cathode ray tube, which is why we still call television the tube. But who got there first? The corporate spy or the Idaho farm boy with the beat field vision?
Claim 15 in Farnsworth's patent 1773-980 proves that Farnsworth is truly the father of electronic television.
Zworykin is the father of television. There is no doubt about that. I mean, it is filed in the U.S. Patent Office in the late fall of 1923, the first patent of electronic television tube. He is the father of television.
It was up to the courts to decide. The patent battle raged for years, and the final decision? The father of the modern television, Philo Farnsworth.
It was a big victory for Farnsworth and certainly a great defeat for RCA. David Sarnoff couldn't have been happy about this. It meant they were going to have to pay royalties.
So patent control for electronic television belonged to Farnsworth.
But the problem is he may have done it too early. He got his first patents in 1927. And by the time television got going commercially after the war, because World War II delayed things for 5 years, many of his patents had expired. So he was no longer receiving royalties for it, and RCA had taken over the manufacturing of television sets. Farnsworth just got left in the cold.
Farnsworth may have won in court, but he lost in the marketplace. Today, we all know his invention, but we barely know the name Philo Farnsworth. And what would the rival inventors think of what's become of television?
There's one very interesting story about Zworykin. I believe it was in Canada in 1954, when some Canadian reporter asked him what his favorite thing was on television. And he always had a very pronounced Russian accent to the end of his life. He said, "Das switch." And the man said, "I beg your pardon." He said, "Das switch," to turn the damn thing off. He was very saddened that television didn't realize its potential.
But in July of 1969, Farnsworth and his wife sat in their home in Salt Lake City, and they watched Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon. And he turned to his wife and he said, "This has made it all worthwhile."
Ta-da!
July 20th, 1969, the best day in human history.
Glad to know you think that way.
Well, the day that humans finally landed on the moon.
All right.
I'm fairly certain that thousands of years in the future, the name Neil Armstrong will be remembered more than, well, what other names?
Perhaps, but again, we're on to broadcast history.
Christopher Columbus.
Sam, I need to review for the exam now.
Let's do that.
Okay, good idea. All right, so Zworykin didn't think television was great, right? Newton T. Minow said that television is what? The vast wasteland. That's right. So Zworykin wasn't the only critic. But there you go. That's the answer to one of the questions on the exam. Minow thinks that television is a vast wasteland. So this is your review stack here, which is, it's a little video that's, I'll make it more visible on the website as well, but it's in the announcements that got emailed to you, so I hope that'll be useful. So this is like the PowerPoints that contain all the points that are of interest for the exam, right? And you've seen all of the questions on the exam. They were posed to you as Kahoots before. So, you know, sometimes we all got the answers right, sometimes we didn't. So be sure that you review all of this stuff so that you got the chance to do as well as you can on this exam. So one of the things that we should look at when we're looking at this was the contrast between point-to-point and mass communication, right? So telegraphy was the early point-to-point system, which is, a precursor to mass communication. So that's an important point to know about. So we also acquainted ourselves with the timeline of development, and what we noticed is that with digitization comes an enormous amount of innovation in a short period of time. So this in the textbook is related to Moore's law, and it's also just an issue of all of the innovation sort of clustering towards the later period of history, right? With digitization, you'll remember being credited for being, the biggest revolution in communication since the printing press from Gutenberg, right? So one-to-many model, that's mass communication, and we said that books and newspapers were the original mass communication medium. So that was the beginnings of mass communication. As we go forward, we looked at some models of communication, some of which were quite complex, but this one is pretty simple. It's called the mathematical model of communication from Shannon and Weaver, who were two engineers at Bell Labs. So this is the one where you have a transmitter, a channel, and a receiver, which send the message. So you can see how this, mathematical model of communication works well for technical communication, like sending a message through television or something like that, public service announcements. Okay, we also looked at regulation and the starts of regulation, the beginnings of regulation of electronic media. So what we said is that the rationale for why the government here in the United States should be able to control media, even though we have, the First Amendment to the Constitution, was that the government should not interfere in the press, and the press was the mass medium of its day. It was newspapers, right? When the Founding Fathers were around, there was no electronic media, but it's clear that they meant that the government should not mess with public communication. However, the FCC was mandated to intervene based on the idea that the broadcast spectrum, the radio waves that are used for radio and television, are scarce, and so the government needs to be involved in putting out the resources of the country to the people. So that's in other words, what I'm trying to say is just the way that if you want to purchase land or something like that, ultimately it's the people of the United States who have the land of the United States. So the government gets involved in regulating. Yes, if you have a similarly scarce resource, which is the radio waves, the government says, well, it's up to us to make sure that we regulate how people use it on behalf of the people of the United States. I have a hard time saying it today. I don't know why, but that's it. So this is why now there's different protections for broadcasting versus cable, which would be a subscription-based electronic medium. So cable TV, you can show TNA. You can say swear words that you can't say on broadcast TV because that's regulated by the government. Yeah, another model of communication breaks down electronic media consumption into its effects. So a cognitive effect, an example of that would be if you learn something when you're watching television, something happens in your cognition. An emotional effect would be if you're watching a show and you got scared, or a behavioral effect would be if you watched a commercial and you decided to go out and buy, a pack of cigarettes, which is why they ban cigarette advertisements from the air. So that would be behavioral. It gets you up and you do some behavior. So that model breaks those effects down, right? And am I playing here? Okay, another way of distinguishing between media is asynchronous versus synchronous. So synchronous is more of the electronic mass medium quality. That is when, for instance, if you're watching a sports broadcast, as it's being broadcast, you're watching it. So it's almost instantaneous that, you know, you're down there, they're having the Super Bowl and you're at home watching. That's synchronous because as it goes on, it's live. Asynchronous is when you can watch something after the fact. So a lot of streaming video, for instance, is asynchronous because you can go to Netflix anytime and watch anything you want, versus synchronous, which is the Super Bowl, is a live broadcast. So, is that clear? Yeah, cool, great. Another concept that comes up a lot in the context of digital media is convergence. So in digital media especially, boundaries and platforms start to blur. You know, used to be if you wanted to watch TV, you had to have a TV and you had a separate radio. Everything was kind of separated out. But now, as I'm reading in your media diaries, everything comes together in your phone. Text, audio, video, it's all converging, you know, and in fact, some people are consuming music through YouTube. A lot of people are, you know, just using YouTube, a video channel on demand, for music deliveries. So that's an example of convergence where the boundaries blur. Okay, just stop me if you have a question about anything as we go along. Whoops, I jumped over Moore's Law. So Moore's Law is oh my God, now I'm running, oh no. So stop. Stop and back up. There it is. And pause, thank you. So Moore's Law was originally coined to talk about the development of computer processors. The idea is that every year the processing power doubles. In this case, in the textbook, it says, well, take a look at the pace of innovation on that timeline. It's like as we go on, it gets more and more, the technological innovation accelerates as you go along. Boom, okay. Important people in the history of broadcasting, of radio. So Marconi we tend to think of as the father of radio, but in fact it was a cumulative invention, let's say. So Marconi shows us the practical demonstration of radio waves. Hey, you can use it like this. But we had Heinrich Hertz, who was demonstrating early on the existence of radio waves with his spark experiment, where you'd have a spark in one place and you'd see it again. Fessenden was able to take, Marconi's idea of transmitting radio waves, but actually put voice and audio over that. And De Forest, remember, he had the Audion tube, right? The Audion tube was an amplifier tube, which made the radio much more powerful and much easier to hear over long distances. So that was De Forest. So all of these people were involved in the invention of AM radio. As we continue on, we did talk about that already. Just a reminder, the Congress gives itself the authority to regulate broadcasting because the airwaves belong to the people. They're a scarce resource, so they should partition it out. All right. So an early figure in American broadcasting was David Sarnoff, who eventually became the president of NBC for decades and decades. Early on, before that happened, he had been in the American Marconi Company, which became RCA, and he had written that influential radio music box memo, which said, hey, we could use radio as a mass medium to send music into people's homes. They would like that. You remember this from the Kahoot, right? So the U.S. government took control of radio stations and the patents during the First World War. So remember, the radio's development was hindered by patent wars until that war, when the government took it all over and radio got better right away. Remember, in the 1920s, the big players kind of partitioned out the radio industry in a very non-competitive way. And so Westinghouse created and marketed radio sets. Others, AT&T did something different. RCA did something different. NBC did something different. But the question will be about Westinghouse. All right. Remember that before we really talked about networks, they talked about chain broadcasting. But it's the same thing. It's the idea that numerous affiliate stations will carry the same signal, and it's transmitted from one station out to the whole network, and they all broadcast it at the same time. So that's the chain broadcasting it became what we know as network broadcasting. So the network system was created to share content. The problem with your local station couldn't come up with enough content to fill all of its broadcast time. So, boom, but what if we make one set of programs and distribute them across many affiliate stations? It's kind of taking advantage of the ability to distribute far and wide. So that was an important kind of brainwave for one of the rules that the FCC created was the fairness doctrine. Do I dare back up for a second? So they were concerned that television could, radio broadcasting in the day, could be used just on behalf of one political view. So there was the fairness doctrine, which gave equal opportunity for political candidates' use of the airwaves. What that meant is if you had a conservative on, immediately after you had to have a liberal. But that was dismissed in the 1980s and then officially taken out of the rule book in 1996. So that was the fairness doctrine. Gone. The Biltmore Agreement, that was another early development. Remember, newspapers were afraid that radio stations would take away their business by broadcasting all the news. So first they didn't share any information, and then with the Biltmore Agreement, they decided that, radio, you can broadcast news, but only after we finish selling our newspapers. So in the Second World War, remember, one of the developments was that newsprint was rationed. Radio advertising boomed because there weren't enough newspapers for advertisers to use, but they could go to radio. On the other hand, all of the technological development of television and radio was diverted to defense. And although, as we saw, Edwin Armstrong invented FM radio in the 30s, Sarnoff quashed it, and FM radio took off very slowly through to the 1950s, when, as we saw, television cannibalized all of radio's, shows and personalities and such. So FM began to become more interesting when rock and roll took off, and the kids wanted to hear better quality music, and FM radio had better quality than AM. So it slowly overtook AM in the 50s until by the 1960s FM radio became the place to hear music, and AM was mostly given over to talk radio or kind of top 40 and stuff. Whoops, I jumped over one. Let's back up here. Currently, the state of the art, as we said, which is not very popular amongst audiences, is this HD radio working on the system of IBOC. So what IBOC means is that in your frequency, like 106.1, you can actually have your analog signal plus several digital signals, all on one channel. However, this has not proved to be very interesting to audiences because they don't want to buy those receivers. As radio faces competition from Spotify, from other sources of music, one of the things that radio can still do is to be local. So there is a return to localism in the sense that radio stations will play up the local angle, that they're part of the community. They know what's going on here. If you go to Spotify or Apple Radio, you're just getting songs with no local flavor. the FCC itself was interested in preserving localism too. So there was a move on to have that codified. And then we get into the television days. So we talked about all of these people being influential in the creation of radio, regardless of who ultimately got the patent or the credit. There was Baird, there was Bjorken, and who's the other guy? The Idaho farm boy?
Farnsworth.
Farnsworth, Philo T. Farnsworth. Yeah, it's got one of the best names in broadcasting history. That's right. So, Farnsworth, who you would have hoped would have gotten rich from licensing his patents so that RCA could build, but it didn't work out that well, fortunately for him. So in the early days of TV, we said television stations were networked. We went over here the important information. So the most profitable television stations are affiliated with networks. They have these clearance agreements, which means that they agree to broadcast everything that the network sends them. They were originally compensated for that, paid to do that by the network. But now that is kind of flipped around, and that's no longer common. Early on in the development of television, there was a freeze in the late 40s, the early 50s, while the FCC figured out how to organize the television spectrum and stuff, which gave enormous advantage to the early network. And then we talked about the history of cable. Oh my God. Cable TV was originally called community antenna TV because it meant that a bunch of people would pay to get connected to an antenna, get them better reception, so that they could, see what they were paying for. In order to protect plain old broadcasting, the FCC had the must-carry rule, which meant that the local cable system would have to must carry the local television stations. You couldn't go and bring a station in from somewhere else and cut out the local affiliates. And then, I think we're coming to the end of this, you'll be happy to know, right? There's that quote, "the vast wasteland," from Newton Minow, who was an FCC chairman who pushed very hard for educational broadcasting and brought that stuff in. So that covers all of the questions, okay? So this little video is probably in your City College email, and I'll also put a link to it on the modules, or I'll put it on the modules on the homepage, I guess. So you guys can run this video and remember all the great moments of learning we've had. Okay, so next class, as I said, you can either come in and write the exam on paper. It's a quiz. You can write it on paper, or you can stay at home and do it online, whatever you prefer. Questions? Good, we're all done.